The night they left, the stars were perfect. I have thought about that detail many times since, across more years than I can usefully count. The stars were perfect that night. Not the way they are sometimes perfect by chance, the specific arrangement of cloud and wind producing a clarity that lasts an hour and is gone. Perfect in the way of a night that has decided to be perfect. The whole sky opened from horizon to horizon, every light burning with the particular sharpness that comes in the cold season when the air has nothing left in it to soften what the sky contains. Elwie's people called it a sign. Of course they did. When you have decided to do something, the world obliges you with signs. I didn't go with them. My name is not important. I was not a significant elf. I had no great deeds to my name, no particular wisdom that separated me from the thousands of others who stood on the western shore that night and watched the host begin to move. I was one of the Avari, which is the name that was given to those of us who refused, though we did not call ourselves that, and the name carries in it a judgment that was not ours to make about ourselves. We were simply the ones who looked at what was being offered and said, "No, I want to explain what that meant," not to justify it. Justification implies that the choice required defending, and I have never believed it did. I want to explain it because the explanation has been lost, buried under the long history of what came after, under the greatness of what the ones who left accomplished, and the grief of what they suffered. And in all of that, the simple fact of why some of us stayed has been reduced to a word. Fear. They say we were afraid. We were not afraid, or rather, fear was present, as it is present in any honest reckoning with something unknown. But fear was not the reason. Fear was the weather. The reason was something else. Let me tell you what Quivienan was. I was born there, if born is the word for what happened to us in that place, the waking in darkness beside still water with the stars above, and the specific sense of a world that was entirely new and entirely ours. There were perhaps 300 of us in the First Awakening, though the numbers grew across the early years as more eyes opened beside the lake and more voices joined the conversation that we were all, in those first years, conducting with the darkness and the water and the sky. The darkness was not a hardship. I want to be clear about this because it is always misunderstood by those who came later, who grew up in a world with the sun and the moon and cannot imagine what it was to live without them. The darkness was not an absence. It was a presence, a specific quality of the world that we had learned to read, the way you learn to read anything you grow up inside. We knew that darkness the way a fish knows water, not as a limitation, but as the medium of existence, the thing in which all other things were visible if you knew how to look. The stars were our light, and we were sufficient to each other and to the world we were in. I will tell you something about those early years that none of the histories record, because the histories were written by people who had left and who understood the early world only as a starting point, as the place before the real story began. The early world was not a starting point. It was itself, complete in the way that a thing is complete when it has everything it needs and nothing in it is waiting to become something else. We had language from the beginning, or something that became language quickly enough that I cannot remember a time before it. We named things, the lake and the trees, and the movements of the stars and the specific sounds that the night made in different seasons. Every name was a discovery, and every discovery was shared, passed from one to another, around the fires we learned to make in the cold season, accumulated into a body of knowledge about the world that was ours and no one else's, built from nothing by the first minds that had ever tried to understand what the world was. We were not helpless. This is also lost in the histories, the assumption that the early elves were naive creatures, stumbling through a dark world waiting to be found and educated by beings wiser than themselves. We had learned to survive in a world that contained real dangers, including things that came out of the north in the early years that we did not have names for yet, and that taught us, quickly and at real cost, the difference between the darkness that was safe and the darkness that was not. We had learned to fight and to hide, and to read the signs that told us which of those was appropriate. And we had built something resembling a community, with the specific texture of a community that has been forged by shared difficulty rather than given as a gift. And the world was extraordinary. I know this sounds like the claim of someone defending a choice they made and trying to make it seem more reasonable in retrospect. It is not that. The world was extraordinary in ways that had nothing to do with my choice and everything to do with what the world actually was. The eastern lands, the great forests to the south of Quivienan, the mountains to the west that we could see on clear nights as a darkness against the darker sky, the rivers that ran through the land with the specific sound that rivers make when no one has ever heard them before. We were the first things in that world that could understand what they were hearing. Every sound was a discovery. Every path through the trees was a path no one had ever walked. Oromel came to us out of that world, a being of such specific and overwhelming presence that the first sight of him divided us. Some toward him and some away, some reading what he was as light, and some reading what he was as threat. I was among those who stayed to look, which perhaps tells you something about the kind of elf I was. Not brave, exactly. Curious in a way that was stronger than the reasonable instinct to retreat from something that large and that bright and that clearly not a thing that belonged to the world as we had understood it. He told us about Valinor across many visits, across years of slow and careful communication between beings so different from each other that the communication itself was an achievement. He told us about the Valar, about the light that existed in the west beyond the sea, about the city the Valar had built, and the trees whose light was unlike anything in the world we knew. He told us about the journey, the great march west, the sea crossing, the arrival in a land where nothing was dark and nothing was dangerous, and the things that hunted us in the forests of the east could not follow. I listened to everything he said. I did not disbelieve him. This is important because the account that has come down through history suggests that the Avari refused because we did not believe, or because we were too limited in our understanding to grasp what was being offered. This is wrong. I understood exactly what was being offered. That was not the problem. The problem was the other thing I understood. The Valar were asking us to leave, not asking us to visit, not asking us to see Valinor and return, asking us to go and to stay, to make the West our home and this world a thing we had passed through on our way to somewhere better. And I looked at that invitation with the specific attention of someone who has learned, across years of living in a world that contained things that wanted to harm us, to ask of any offered gift the question that the gift itself does not answer. Who benefits? The Valar loved us. I believed this then, and I believe it now. The invitation was genuine, and the light at the end of it was real. I do not dispute any of that. But love and interest are not opposites, and the Valar had interests in this world that were not entirely separate from their interest in us, and the most powerful beings I had ever encountered were asking me to vacate the land where I had awakened and cross an ocean to a place I had never seen on the word of a messenger, however magnificent, however clearly trustworthy he seemed. I was an elf who had learned to read the darkness. I had learned to distinguish between a sound that meant nothing and a sound that meant something, between a stillness that was empty and a stillness that contained something waiting. I had survived in a world that contained Morgoth and his creatures by developing the specific skill of not accepting the surface of things as the whole of things. The invitation had a surface that was extraordinary. Underneath the surface were questions I could not answer. I stayed. I want to address something directly, because it is always the first objection raised by those who hear this account. They say that staying was the easy choice, the fearful choice, the choice of someone unwilling to attempt a difficult journey. They have it exactly backwards. Valinor was the safe choice. The journey was hard, yes, and the sea crossing was genuinely dangerous, and many suffered on the road. But the destination was safety. The destination was a land protected by the full power of the Vala, where Morgoth could not reach and his creatures could not follow, and the specific darkness that hunted us in the forests of the east was not a thing that existed. We stayed in a world where it existed. We stayed in a world where Morgoth was real and present and aware of us, where his servants moved through the forests we moved through, where the danger that had killed people we knew did not diminish because the safer people had chosen to leave. If anything, it increased as the protective presence of the Eldar withdrew westward and the eastern lands were left to those of us who remained and whatever Morgoth chose to send into them. I knew this. Every one of the Avari knew this. We were not choosing safety. We were choosing this world, with everything that this world contained, including the thing in the north that hated us and had the power to act on that hatred. We made that choice with clear eyes. The ones who say we stayed from fear have never understood what staying actually cost. It was not a dramatic decision. This is the other thing that has been lost in the retelling. The histories that describe the Great March, the departure of the Eldar, make it sound as though the choosing happened all at once, in a single moment of decision that divided the elves into those who went and those who refused. It was not like that. It was a process across months, a gradual understanding among some of us that we were not going to be among those who moved, that the preparations being made around us were not preparations we were joining. My closest companion through the early years, an elf whose name I will keep because it is not mine to give, came to me 3 weeks before the departure and asked me directly what I had decided. I told him I was staying. He looked at me for a long time without speaking, which was his way when he was processing something that mattered to him, and then he told me he had decided to go. We did not argue. There was nothing to argue about. We had both made honest assessments of the same situation and arrived at different conclusions, and we were both old enough by then to understand that this was something that happened between people who were thinking clearly rather than evidence that one of them was not. But we sat together for most of that night without speaking much, and what passed between us in the silence was the specific content of a friendship that had been built across thousands of years of the world's first darkness, all the shared discoveries and the shared dangers and the specific texture of knowing someone so well that speech becomes supplementary rather than necessary. We had named things together in the early years, sitting beside the lake, competing to find the word that best described what the thing in question actually was. We had developed between us a private vocabulary of observations about the world that neither of us used with anyone else. I did not know, sitting with him that night, that I would not see him again. I suspected it, but the full weight of what a permanent separation across an ocean meant was not something I could entirely hold in my mind while he was still sitting beside me. He left with the host 3 weeks later. I watched him go from the western shore, found his specific shape in the movement of thousands, kept it in sight longer than made practical sense, and then he was gone into the darkness toward the sea. I have not seen him since. This is the part of the choice that has cost most across the years. Not doubt about whether Valinor was real, or whether the light was extraordinary, or whether he found there what Rome had described. I assume he did. I hope he did. What I have carried is the specific absence of the one person who had been present for everything I was before the departure, who had shared the early world with me in the way that early things are shared, completely and without reservation, because we did not yet know that the world would eventually require us to hold some things back. I have wondered, across the years that followed, what he found in Valinor. I have wondered whether it was what Rome described, whether the light of the trees was as extraordinary as we had been told, whether the city was as beautiful as the stories suggested. I have assumed that it was, because the grief of those who eventually returned from there in defiance of the valor was too large and too specific to be the grief of people who had left a disappointment. I have not wondered whether I made the wrong choice. This is the thing that is hardest to convey, the thing that sounds most like defensiveness when it is least intended as defensiveness. I did not spend the years that followed the departure in doubt about what I had chosen, not because I was certain that Valinor was not what it was said to be, but because the choice was never really about Valinor. The choice was about this, about the specific quality of the forest to the south of Quivienan in the season when the trees were heavy with what the season had done to them, and the light, when it finally came, filtered through the canopy in the way that it filtered through canopy, and not through any other thing. About the sound of the lake in the cold season, when the edges froze and the center did not, and the movement of the water under the ice made a sound that I have never heard anywhere else, and that I heard for thousands of years before and after the departure. About the paths through the eastern hills that I had walked so many times that my feet knew the ground before my eyes confirmed it, that I had walked in the darkness of the world's first years and continued to walk after the sun came and changed the texture of everything it touched. This was not nostalgia. Nostalgia is the longing for a past that is gone. What I had was a present. The world I had known was still there, still the world I had awakened into, changed by the sun and the centuries, but continuous with what it had always been, mine in the way that a thing can only be yours if you have grown up inside it and stayed. Let me tell you what Middle-earth gave me that I do not believe Valinor could have given me, because this is the part of the argument that is hardest to make to someone who did not stay. It gave me difficulty, real difficulty, the kind that comes from living in a world that does not adjust itself to your needs, that is indifferent to your comfort and your grief and your plans, that presents you year after year with problems that have no clean solution and require instead the specific intelligence of someone who has learned to work within constraints rather than transcend them. The valor made Valinor as a gift. A world made as a gift is a different thing from a world that was not made for you at all, that preceded you and will outlast you, and that you must negotiate with rather than inhabit. I became, across the long years after the departure, a different kind of elf than I would have become in Valinor. Harder in some ways, more patient in others, possessed of a knowledge of loss and difficulty that I suspect the elves who grew up in Valinor's light did not carry in the same way. When the Noldor returned, those who came back from Valinor to fight Morgoth on these shores, I could see in them something I recognized and something I did not. The brilliance was real. The power of what they had become in the West was unmistakable. But there was also, in some of them, a specific quality of someone who has not previously been asked to lose things they cannot recover, and it made them, in some ways, less prepared for what the world they had returned to required. I had been losing things and recovering from losing them for a very long time. This is not a boast. It is simply what staying in the world produces in you, eventually, if you pay attention. Valinor was paradise. I have no doubt of this. But it was a paradise made by someone else, shaped by the valor for the valor, and offered to us in the generous spirit of people who believe that what they have made is the best thing that can be made, and want others to have it. I did not doubt the generosity. I doubted something smaller and more specific. I doubted whether what was best for the Valar was identical to what was best for me, and I doubted whether anyone, however powerful, however loving, could fully answer that question on my behalf. I was the elf who had learned to read the darkness. The darkness was mine. The light that replaced it was also, eventually, beautiful, and I learned to read that too. But what I had been in the darkness was not a lesser thing waiting for correction. It was the first thing I had ever been, and it was entirely my own. The ones who left accomplished extraordinary things. I know the histories, the wars, the duels, the heroes, the grief on a scale that the world has not seen before or since. I know about Feanor and his sons, about Fingolfin challenging Morgoth at the gates of Angband, about the loves and the losses and the specific quality of greatness that seems to require suffering as its precondition. I know that the world was changed by what they did, and that the change mattered, and that some of what they fought for was worth the cost. I also know what happened to the world they left behind. I will tell you what the years after looked like, because this too is absent from the histories. We moved. The departure of the Eldar did not leave us standing on the western shore looking after them. It left us with the eastern world, which was large and varied, and which required, now that its population had been dramatically reduced, a different relationship with its geography. We spread across the forests and the hills and the river valleys, small groups of us, dozens rather than thousands, learning the territory the way you learn territory when you have no choice but to know it well. We built things. Nothing on the scale of Gondolin, nothing that required the accumulated knowledge of craftsmen who had spent time in Valinor and returned with their heads full of what could be made. Small things, careful things, settlements shaped to the specific demands of the places they were in, rather than imposing a vision of what a settlement should be on land that had its own opinion about the matter. We learned the eastern peoples, the men who moved through the same forests we moved through, and we developed the long, slow work of coexistence with beings whose lives were so much shorter than ours that the relationships required a kind of patience we had not previously needed. A man you knew as a young adult would be old before you had aged visibly. His children would not remember meeting you, but you would remember meeting them. His grandchildren would hear stories about you that had already become uncertain in their accuracy. We became, to the eastern peoples, something between neighbors and legends, present enough to be real, long-lived enough to be uncanny. This was its own kind of knowledge, and its own kind of responsibility. We were not idle, the ones who stayed. We did not sit beside Quivienan waiting for the great events to reach us. We moved through the eastern lands across the ages, and the things we built were smaller than what the Eldar built in the west, smaller than Gondolin, smaller than Menegroth, smaller than the works of the Noldor and the Sindar in all their brilliance. But they were ours, and the land that contained them was ours, and the specific knowledge of how to live in that land, which had been developed across thousands of years by people who never left, was a kind of knowledge the returners did not have, and had to learn slowly and with difficulty when they came back. We had never left. We knew where the water was in the dry season, and where the passes were before the snow closed them, and which of the eastern peoples could be trusted, and which could not. We knew the shape of the world the way you know the shape of something you have never been away from. This was not the greatness that makes histories. It was the other kind of greatness, the kind that does not get written down. The night they left, the stars were perfect. I stood on the western shore, and I watched the host move, and I held in my mind at the same time two things that seemed as though they should not be able to coexist. The genuine beauty of what I was watching, thousands of my people moving together toward something they believed in, the specific dignity of a great decision being enacted by people who had made it honestly, and the equal genuine certainty that I was not going with them, that the western shore was not my destination, that my destination was the forest to the south, the lake to the east, the paths through the hills that my feet had memorized across thousands of years of walking them. I turned away before they were out of sight, not because it was too painful to watch, because I had seen enough, and the forest was waiting, and I had been away from it long enough. I have been asked, in the years since, whether I regret it. The question assumes that regret is the appropriate response to a choice that cost you something. I did lose something that night. I lost my companion of the early years, and I lost the possibility of what he found in Valinor, and I lost the specific kind of certainty that comes from following the advice of beings more powerful and more knowing than yourself. What I kept was everything else: the forest, the lake, the stars above Quivienan, that were the first things I ever saw, and that were perfect, I can tell you from direct experience. On the night the great host departed, and have remained, across all the years since, exactly what they were on the night I first opened my eyes beside still water, and found that the world was extraordinary, and that I was in it. I was right to stay. I know this not because everything went well, because it didn't always go well, but because the alternative was to become someone else in a place made for someone else, and I have never believed that this is what the light at the beginning of the world intended for any of us. The ones who left made the histories. I made a life. I am not certain the difference is as large as the histories suggest.